On behalf of the League of Women Voters of the East Shore, I welcome you to the 98th House of Representatives District Candidates Debate. My name is Joanne Moore, and I live outside this district, which is the League's policy to avoid having a moderator who has a bias. The League of Women Voters is a national, state, and local nonpartisan political organization that welcomes all to join. We're pleased to sponsor debates like this one because we believe in empowering voters and defending democracy. This evening, the candidates for the 98th House District seat are Moira Rader, the Democrat, and Richard DiNardo, the Republican. Okay, we're going to ask you to hold your applause until the end, at which time we encourage enthusiastic applause. The order of questions being asked has been determined prior to the debate, and each candidate will have up to 1 minute to answer each question. Then they can be followed by a 30-second response upon their request. After a good number of questions, or after an opening statement of 1 minute each, there will be a number of questions, and then there will be a lightning round, which will give the candidates 60 seconds to answer a question, but no 30-second additions after that. So, candidates, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Ms. Rader will go first. And I'll give you 60 seconds for your opening statement.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters of the East Shore for this opportunity. I'm happy to have that opportunity to introduce myself and hopefully garner your support for my candidacy. For those who don't know me, I am Moira Rader. My husband and I have 4 children, 4 teenagers, and we live here in Guilford and have for the past decade. I was born in Connecticut, raised on Long Island, and returned here in 2001 to work in my profession as an architect. My educational background is an undergrad from Villanova University, and like I mentioned, a graduate degree from Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture. So that's my professional background. I also hold a real estate license in the state of Connecticut. But what's most important about my candidacy tonight, I think, is that I want to explain to you my leadership role in this community. When we moved here 10 years ago, my husband and I both feel very strongly about public service. And so as a young mother, I quickly joined the PTO, and you know, when you volunteer, you quickly get advanced to be on that board, and I was asked to be treasurer and at the same time volunteered in our church for many years. I'm sorry that I can't continue this talk, but I hope I'll gain your support over the evening in answering questions. So thank you.
Yes, there is a big red stop sign that goes up at the end of her 60 seconds. So, Mr. DiNardo.
Well, hello, I'm Richard DiNardo. I'd like to thank also the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this event. I lived in Guilford for 27 years, which by local standards means I'm still a newcomer. I live here with my wife and 2 children, both of whom attend Guilford Public Schools. I'm an attorney, but I've run small businesses most of my life, all of my life, in fact, working life. I also built a plastics factory once to pay for graduate school and taught history for a few years too. I'm running for state representative because I feel our government no longer works for the average citizen. I've knocked on nearly 3,000 doors on this campaign so far, and a lot of these people in this district, I can tell you, are not doing well, especially the further you go from the shoreline. They feel overtaxed, overregulated, and overmandated by a state government that they feel no longer cares about them or shares their values, and they want their lives back. They don't like what they're seeing in Hartford and Washington, and they want change in their leadership. So I'm running for state representative to ensure that our state government puts the interests of our people first.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is again, just 1 minute with no rebuttals. And I'll start with you, Mr. DiNardo. What are the main issues you plan to focus on that will benefit your district?
Well, I'm particularly concerned about the business-friendly environment in Connecticut to make it possible for people who have not been in business before to start up businesses for the first time. I think small business is one of the best ways for people to improve not only their financial situation, but also their independence as citizens. I'm interested in affordability. Connecticut has become too expensive. We're losing people, and I want to focus on that. And also parental rights. As a father, I think it's very important that we respect the constitutional and fundamental rights of parents to direct the education and upbringing of their children.
Thank you. And Ms. Rader.
Thank you. I did want to share just briefly that, when we talk about priorities for our district, one of the top priorities for any community should be their public school system. And myself, I've served on the Board of Education now in my second term. I'm now the vice chair. And much like my opponent, I've spent a lot of time on doors, community events, making phone calls, and just by being in public service for the last decade, getting to really hear the voices and concerns of our constituents. I too feel, I think every family in this room can understand the burden of inflation and how things feel more expensive at the grocery store or the gas. But I also know what Connecticut has done in the last year in the bills of the legislature to relieve the gas tax. They extended a child tax credit. I know my family received that. Pensions and annuities for seniors. These are all really good things. But when I'm on doors, there are other things that people talk to me about. They talk about mental health care. They talk about making their health care more affordable, truly affordable. They talk about gun safety legislation. They talk about our environment. And yes, they talk about the opportunities for small businesses. Thank you.
Well, you gave us good introductions because we're going to cover a lot of those topics in these questions tonight. And I'll start with you, Ms. Rader, on this one. Would you propose altering the state's tax system to make Connecticut more affordable for more people?
Thank you for the question. I think that, like I just mentioned, I feel that Connecticut is in a very strong fiscal position right now. We have paid down a significant amount of our pension debt, and we've also put away a lot of money in we've maxed out our rainy day fund. We've also extended some of the tax credits that I've explained to you. There's absolutely more we can do. I know that there's a lot of some tax burdens on small businesses. We need to look at that and make it easier for small business to come here and thrive. I'd love to see the opportunity for our families to have a little less burden at a time when it's very hard to carry those bills that come in every month. Now, I'll be a first-time legislator, and I'm excited about the opportunity to learn more ways that we can accomplish that. But I do think that we have to recognize that we are in a strong position where we can actually, the money we're saving on an annual basis simply by paying down our pension debt is going to mean more resources that are going to be able to come back to the taxpayers.
Thank you. And 60 seconds, Mr. DiNardo, altering the tax system.
Well, I would propose cutting our income tax from 5% to 4%, our sales tax. Connecticut has over 300 taxes, and some of them cost more to collect than they actually bring in. We have hidden taxes. One of my least favorite ones is the Safe Homes Fund tax, which appeared on everyone's renewal of their homeowners insurance. It's a tax that actually pays for foundations to be fixed in Westville. I think it's wonderful that people in Westville get their foundations fixed, but I don't believe the state of Connecticut is prepared to fix my foundations if something happened. The meal tax is something that I think should be eliminated. I think some people consider it a luxury tax. It basically is an increased sales tax on prepared meals or restaurant meals. But in fact, a lot of single parents or parents who don't have someone who can come home to cook rely on those prepared meals to feed their children. And so I don't really think it's a luxury. I would do away with that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Do you want 30 seconds more on that?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. This starts with you, Mr. DiNardo. How do you view the roles of the state and private sector to help improve the state's economy?
Well, I think that all things being equal, we should always look to the private sector to fix the state's economy, to improve the state's economy. The business environment needs to be improved for them to do that, though. I mean, there was an interesting study done by George Mason University, which showed that between 1997 and 2015, there was a 56% increase in the regulatory burden in Connecticut, which in itself, accounting for ruling out other factors, increased poverty in Connecticut by 14%. Higher income inequality, reduced entrepreneurship, increased consumer prices, all as a result directly of a regulatory burden. So we need to address that so that we can allow our private sector to improve the economy in Connecticut.
Thank you. And Ms. Rader.
Could you repeat the question again?
How do you view the roles of the state and the private sector to help improve the state's economy?
Right. Thank you. Well, much like I've mentioned already, I think that we have to get beyond the headlines and talk about the real story. And I'm very appreciative of the tax credits that came back to our state this year, to our citizens this year. Much like my opponent mentioned, we do have to encourage small business. We need to make it easier to enter a small business. We need to be there to support them, and we need to find ways to fuel that. We also need to talk about nonprofits. We need to find ways to better support them. They are the heart of a community. We can just think, just in Guilford and Branford alone, of so many agencies and organizations that support our communities. Where social services can't, they do. So I'd like to see more focus put on that and more resources put towards our nonprofits.
Thank you. Enough on that one?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, we're getting, how can this goes to you first, Ms. Rader.
Sure.
How can state government support more diversity in our workforce, but especially in our classrooms, getting teachers in?
So important. As I mentioned, I've been on the Board of Education now for 5 years. I've loved the work that we have done. I'm proud of the work we've done. And I'm proud also of the work we've done around diversity. It's a very challenging thing at times because you have to have the avenues and the encouragement for folks to want to enter your district. And what we've done, and we've participated in a group, it's a grant program through the state through CREC. And it's for minority graduate students that they are given a grant to come work in Guilford while they receive their education. And then they are also then encouraged, hopefully, to stay in that district and continue working with us. So that's just an example. But I do think we need to think back to the education of our educators. We have free, 2-year community college here in the state of Connecticut. Obviously, that's not enough to reach teacher certification, but let's find ways to take those students who are interested in education and create opportunities for them, either with tuition assistance or, other avenues. We have a large lack of, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Mr. DiNardo.
I understand the concerns for diversity. I grew up in the Bronx, and I lived in a very diverse area. And the interesting thing was, it was diverse because people were actually treated each other as equals and as they wished to be treated themselves. They were not particularly concerned with what they looked like or what their ethnicity was. I think that's a much better approach. I don't think we should be overly concerned with what someone's ethnicity is in hiring or in teaching. I think that having someone who is different from you teaching you is every bit as valuable as someone who shares some of your some of your ethnicity or your background, but it's almost completely irrelevant. I know so many examples of teachers who had almost nothing in common with their students except the brilliance of the professor and the receptivity of the students. So don't put diversity with respect to race or ethnicity very high on my list of things that we need to do. What we really need to do is to treat everyone as equals and allow the diversity to take care of itself.
Can I add something to that, please? Thank you.
30 more seconds.
I would differ on that opinion. I think diversity is critically important. I think diversity is something that our children need to learn more about, our equity and inclusion. And I know those seem like ugly words to some people probably in this room. It's not. We absolutely have minority students in our schools that don't feel equal or don't feel that they can identify with an educator. So I think it would be critically important to be able to encourage more diversity in our teaching staff.
Yeah, Mr. DiNardo.
Yeah, the biggest determinant of what happens to someone in society is not their race. I'm convinced of that. It's their education, their income, their upbringing, and their family. So those factors, if a child has those factors in their favor, they'll succeed regardless of what their so-called race or ethnicity is. If they don't have those factors, they won't succeed. So we need to be focusing on the vulnerabilities of our families, irrespective of race.
Okay. You'll start the next question with you, Mr. DiNardo. 1 minute. How can Connecticut improve academic performance, especially in our urban schools? Or do you think school safety needs more attention?
Having been to an urban school in a very poor neighborhood when I was a child, I know that they can be excellent. It had to do with the staff, and it has to do with the management. They certainly, in many of our schools in Connecticut, for instance in Hartford, have rather large budgets per student, but they don't have particularly good results. So I think that the management of the schools is extremely important. I also support school choice. I do think that wealthier parents shouldn't be the only people who have the option of sending their kids to private schools or parochial schools. And I believe that choice will just improve the standards of schools, both private and public, across the board.
Ms. Rader?
Yeah, so two things. One is I do believe that we have an incredible public school system in Connecticut, and I don't think we should be giving parents the opportunity to take the funding that goes to our public schools and send it out to parents so they can send their children to a private school. That is the baseline of our public education system. We as a community support it. So that's one part of it. I also want to make sure that we understand that it's not a bad thing that we support public education across the board. Inner city schools, yes, they have more funding, but those children are going home to situations that might not happen in a place like Branford or Guilford. And I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that those communities need more social service support, more nonprofit support, and it goes back to my emphasis on really supporting those programs through our tax relief benefits that we could really feed into those communities to make sure that those kids actually get an equitable education.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yeah, parents are already spending money on the local public schools. The difference is they only have a choice. They don't really have a choice of where it goes. So the money is being spent on the child irrespective of where they go, and I think the parents should have a choice on where that is.
Could I just add a little something to that?
Sure.
One thing that's important to know is there's the Open Choice Program, and Guilford actually is going to be participating in that program. And what that allows is for students in New Haven or other districts to come into our district. We also have a magnet program where our students are allowed to participate and apply to various magnet schools throughout the area, in the within the community districts. But it's most important to know that our public schools are the foundation of a community, and if you pull funding away from them, they don't succeed.
It's okay. Thanks.
Okay. This question will go first to you, Ms. Radin. Should the state provide support for pre-K education so that all municipalities can offer it?
I would love to see that happen. The earlier we intervene with our children, the earlier we can touch them in terms of education and exposure socially to a learning environment, the better. Now it costs money. So I'd love to, once we get to the legislature, to really understand how could we fund that. But I don't think you'd find a parent that wouldn't agree that it would be wonderful for their kids to have that early intervention, that early support. So I'm a full supporter of that if we can find a way to make it successful.
And Mr. DiNardo?
Well, I think pre-K education is wonderful. The question is always how do we pay for it and why are we providing it for free to people who may or may not need it. So I think it's wonderful to do it. I prefer, all things being equal, to do it through private agencies and do it through, given how increasingly competitive school seems to be, I'm somewhat less opposed to doing it, for instance, at the public school level than maybe it was a few years ago. So. But I certainly do think that it can be a great boon to children.
Could I just add a little something to that? Thank
Sure,
you.
Ms.
I just
Radin.
think that we also have to be cognizant of the fact that not every family can afford preschool. I know friends who, I remember myself the years of putting our children in preschool. It's expensive. And wouldn't that be a great opportunity for them to have a more structured, supported environment, but also be able to get into a school environment a little earlier? So I would really hope that we could look to find ways to make it happen.
May I?
Sure.
Yeah, I think that perhaps if we don't subsidize parents who can afford for pre-K education, we could have more money available to subsidize those who can't.
Thank you. Okay. I'll change the topic from education. Do you agree with Connecticut's current laws that allow for same-sex marriage and a woman's right to choose? Would you work to modify or reverse either of these? Or would you support allowing them to stand as currently written? This goes to you first, Mr. DiNardo.
Well, since becoming a father, I've considered myself pro-life, which means I believe in the sanctity of human life. But our Supreme Court has affirmed that under our Constitution, abortion is an issue for the people of Connecticut to decide for themselves. So the central question for any representative has to be, what do the people of Connecticut want? And I believe the people of Connecticut do not want major changes to their current laws. So as their representative, I would not support major changes without the consent of my constituents. That said, I do believe that people, whether they're pro-life or pro-choice, mostly agree that the recent push by people mostly in the progressive camp for abortion on demand up to the day of birth is not supported by people in Connecticut. Most people who are either pro-choice or pro-life, and it actually undoes 50 years of Connecticut law, and I don't believe that the people of Connecticut would support it, and I wouldn't support that.
Thank you. Ms. Radin.
I unequivocally support our legislation around women's reproductive rights here in Connecticut. I unequivocally support same-sex marriage and marriage equality, period. But let me get a little more elaborate about this. Connecticut has incredibly strong legislation, but that legislation is not codified into our Constitution, so it is still vulnerable. And if there's any opportunity for other leadership to get honestly at that legislation, it could change in a heartbeat. I want to be very clear, as a parent of 4 children, 3 who are teenage girls, it is stunning to me that I now live in a world where in some states they are not equal in terms of human rights as my son is, or that I am. So we can't be complacent about this issue. We can't assume that everything is fine, because we've seen what's happened in other states, and so we need to be very clear about where we stand on this. And I want to make one other thing very clear. It was presumed that I had some progressive idea about late-term abortions. I have never stated that, and it is unequivocally not true.
Thank you. Mr. DiNardo.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot I didn't get a chance to state my my support for same-sex marriage. I've had gay friends and family members my entire life, and it's not an issue for me. But I want to just also reiterate that I do not believe the people of Connecticut, which the Supreme Court has said have the right to decide abortion laws for themselves, will support abortion on demand up to the day of birth.
Could I just add one more thing to
Ms.
that?
Reed.
Thank you. I'm going to say this because I think it's really important. I feel that this is a decision between a woman and her doctor. And I find it very challenging as a woman and a mother and a friend to women and a sister and a daughter to have men converse about this conversation beyond simply abjectly supporting it. And I just have a hard time with that, but I respect the opinion of everyone here in this room. But please understand, this is a decision between a woman and her doctor, period. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll change the topic. Everyone agrees that mental health or mental illness is a problem throughout our whole society. What legislation would you support to meet the needs of people with mental health issues here in Connecticut? And this goes first to Ms. Radin.
Thank you. Well, first, I was so encouraged by the recent legislation around mental health for our children and our students. It's incredible what's going to be able to be offered within our public school system and in our community resources. But beyond that, we all know what we lived through in this pandemic. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody whose mental health was not impacted by that. So we have a mental health crisis in this country, and it is largely because of that. The other part of this piece is providers. We need to be able to identify and support growing our provider pool. We need to look at reciprocal licensure across state lines. We need to look at telehealth. You know, telehealth was an amazing asset when we were in the pandemic and we were locked down. But unfortunately, a lot of health insurance companies and whatnot decided that once that had passed, that was no longer an opportunity. And so I would just love to see us build upon the things that we learned during the pandemic in terms of resources, but we absolutely need to strengthen our mental health resources throughout the state.
Thank you. Mr. DiNardo.
Well, I do support the idea of mental health parity in the laws in Connecticut. I think that is something that would is justified by the research. But we have to also remember that healthcare is still mostly provided by employers, and so the quality of the overall business environment in our state is going to have a direct effect on the quality of the healthcare. The more prosperous and robust businesses are, the better the benefits they can offer in a way that is consonant with their making a profit. So I would not tend to want to see the state mandate health care or mental health care or regular health care to any great extent if we could do it through the existing private health system.
Let's see.
Just could I add a little
Sure,
something
Ms.
to
Radin.
that? I think it's important to recognize that mental health care is health care, and we absolutely need to make it more affordable and more accessible. We haven't touched on this in terms of health care, but we need to look at a public option. We need to harness the buying power of the state employee plan. We need to look at ways to help nonprofits and small businesses so that they can support their employees to seek out the mental health care that they need.
Last session, the Public Health Committee passed an aid in dying bill. Would you support a similar bill if it reaches the House floor this term? Why or why not? And this goes to you first, Mr. DiNardo.
Honestly, I haven't read the language of an aid in dying bill. So I would be a little hesitant to comment on it. If it's an assisted suicide bill with respect to end of life care, I would say that we should tread very carefully on that. I understand the situation. I lost my own father recently. I understand the situation is difficult and ambiguous. I'm not quite sure I'd want to see that codified by legislators, but again, unless I saw the language of the proposed legislation, I couldn't comment really any further than that.
I see. Okay. Ms.
Thank
Rabin?
you. Sure. This is a difficult topic, right? We've all probably had loved ones or friends or neighbors who have dealt with a terminal illness. I watched my father suffer through cancer over 25 years ago. It was painful to watch him, but it was very painful cancer. And I would never assume to know what he would want for his last days. But what I want to know is I want to be able to have that conversation. And as a legislator, I think we need to talk about it, because if that's what our constituents want us to look at, then that's what we should do. I have my own personal experience around, and thoughts and opinions, but as a representative, you represent the voices of everyone in the room. So I would absolutely want to learn more about it, but I can definitely empathize with the idea and hopefully find a way that puts really strong safeguards around the potential legislation so that we can provide that opportunity if it seems like the right thing for a family member. We can't assume everyone's situation, and we never should, but we can absolutely, hopefully, give them the guidance to have choices. Thank you.
Okay. The environment. Climate change. What efforts would you propose to mitigate climate change and to improve our resilience against climate change? And this goes first to Ms. Radin.
Thank you. Well, we have the wonderful opportunity to live along a gorgeous shoreline, but with that comes the issues of coastal hurricane storms and relying on measures that we can make it more resilient. I'm really encouraged by some really recent legislation, the Clean Air Act, and that's all around our environment and making more efforts to ensure that the future of our state is secure for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. I think we need to look at coastal resiliency from a planning perspective. I know that a lot of communities on the shoreline are developing coastal resiliency plans. I would want to make sure that that funding for that continues. I also think it's a community conversation. I come from a background in architecture and planning and restoration work. And a lot of our building codes need to be looked at. And I know we're looking at a lot of our zoning codes right now. But wouldn't it be a great opportunity to look at how we reconstruct, how we design our roads, our homes, our infrastructure, so that we create a more resilient environment, and that we also think about our natural environment and how we best protect that.
Thank you. Mr. DiNardo.
Well, as a law student, I worked as an intern with the Connecticut Fund for the Environment, and I can say that many of those folks I have a lot of respect for. I tend to favor environmental laws that are cost-effective and have a positive impact on the economy. I remember as a child living by the shoreline before the Clean Water Act, I'm that old, where the shell fishing industry was completely destroyed. And I believe that that environmental measures like the Clean Water Act, which had tremendous bipartisan support, and in fact largely Republican leadership at that time in the environmental movement, that restored a multi-million-dollar shell fishing industry in Connecticut. So I think we should always test environmental proposals to see if they are cost-effective and have a positive impact on our economy, and that we should always look to test them by their real-world results. And in particular with coastal resiliency, I believe that we need to make sure that all of our measures do not impact water-dependent industries such as the boating industry and the shellfishing and fishing industry.
Thank you. Any more on that?
No, thank you.
Okay, we're going to move to transportation, which ties in a little bit with climate as well. But what efforts would you support to improve Connecticut's transportation system, including roads, bridges, trains, bike lanes? And this goes first to Mr. DiNardo.
Well, Connecticut's infrastructure is actually crumbling. I think we ranked near the bottom 10 of states with respect to infrastructure. Luckily, there is a $5 billion federal infrastructure bill that's going to, a federal bill that's going to bring $5 billion of infrastructure aid to Connecticut is coming. We have to make sure that that money is spent properly, efficiently, and transparently with legislative oversight. I do think that we need to improve the New York to Boston corridor through Connecticut. But I believe that the extension from, for instance, Wallingford to Hartford was probably not either necessary or cost effective. So I think there are situations where we're looking at mass transit where we have to really look at where the need is. And I personally would have put those dollars into the New York corridor because that's where the greatest traffic is and the use by people in Connecticut.
Thank you. Ms. Radin?
Can you repeat the question? Just want to make sure.
Yeah. What efforts would you support to improve the Connecticut's transportation system, roads, bridges, trains, bikes?
Great. Well, much like Richard mentioned, we have funding coming from the bipartisan infrastructure bill, over $5.38 billion. There'll also be about $100 billion in competitive grant programs. So we have the funding coming in. It's how we utilize it. And one of the greatest effects of this is going to be job creation. So I'm very encouraged by that. But beyond that, we need to start talking about our transportation system, our roads. Anybody that drives 95 in the summer knows what's happening there. We have congestion, we have overuse. So how do we get folks to utilize our mass transit system? Well, we need to make it better. So we need to look at our bus system. We need to look at our train system. I'm encouraged by conversations around Shoreline East. The pandemic really hit ridership hard. And it's hard to encourage folks to get back to old habits. A lot of folks now work from home, don't need to be commuting. But we need to look at, we get a lot of federal funding and support for both our trains and our buses through the federal government. But we need to encourage more we need to encourage more use of that. And actually that'll have a wonderful environmental impact too.
Thank you. Anything else?
Oh, no.
Okay. Affordable housing. What is your view of the status of affordable housing in your district here? And is it good enough, or is there something we need to support from the state to make it better? And that goes first to you, Ms. Radin.
Sure, thank you. This is a great interest of mine. And I think that we need to make housing affordable. Guilford and Branford are two very different communities in terms of demographics and housing stock and affordable housing. But here in Guilford, I'm encouraged by, we have 3 current projects kind of in the pipeline. One is utilizing the 8-30G legislation. And what that does is it lets developers come in, working with the community, to develop a portion of a new development or apartment building that will be considered affordable. So up on Hubbard Road, we're going to have a building there of about 100 one-bedroom units, and 30% of those will be affordable. We have 2 other projects here in town that are coming that are smaller, but are working with nonprofits. And they're one is land that's been donated by the town, and another is, another close proximity to mass transit. So when we talk about affordable housing in communities, we also need to talk about that proximity to transportation, to downtown, to small businesses. I'll elaborate more later. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. DiNardo.
Yeah, well, we do have a need for affordable housing, but obviously this need is not the same in every town and every city. I think in Branford and Guilford, the greatest need is for long-term residents who may have spent their lives here to be able to stay when they retire or a spouse passes away or they become ill. In the cities, the need may be more for younger people who are just starting out in life. So I think it's very important with respect to affordable housing to make sure that we maintain local control. The problem with 8-30G is that it basically comes in and it's like the nuclear option that blows up the local zoning decisions. And that would be okay if the local zoning boards were acting capriciously or arbitrarily. But the problem with 830G right now, and it needs to be amended, is that it actually allows the developer to override local zoning regulations, even if he's even if he's in violation of those zoning regulations. So it's not just in cases where the board has acted irrationally or arbitrarily. It's even in situations where the developer has violated the law.
Could I just
Sure,
elaborate
Ms.
on that?
Reardon. Yeah.
Well, I think that comes down to relationship building, and I think that we have zoning and we have code violations, we have code regulations too, that no building can be out of, in a code violation, but we have zoning regulations as well. But I think it starts with not creating an antagonistic relationship. We have to make sure that, yes, 830G definitely has some improvements to be made. The intentions are good. We definitely need to look at it deeper, and as anything evolves, that should evolve. But I don't think it should be, I want to just, one last thing is that, well, let's not make affordable housing a stigmatized thing.
Mr. DiNardo, any more?
No, I would just add that obviously affordable housing is a subject that, well, I believe, just to reiterate what I said before, is I think it should be left to the local zoning authorities to decide, and not use 830G.
Thank you. For the past few years, we've had no excuse absentee voting under emergency statutes due to COVID. And that's in force this year. You can get no excuse absentee ballot, but that will expire. What you're going to find on the ballot this time is a referendum, and it says, shall the Constitution be changed to allow the state legislature to enact early voting? And early voting is different than no excuse absentee ballot, because you're in person for a few days or a period of time before the election. So on the ballot this time, if the voters say yes, then the legislature will decide how to enact early voting systems in Connecticut. So if it passes, what would you recommend how to enact that
Who's this guy?
process? Let me see. Mr. DiNardo goes first.
Well, I'm generally against changing the Constitution in general, and in this particular case, I don't think it's justified. I think it would be an undue burden on municipalities. It would be expensive. The danger is less if you're talking about in-person voting, but because Connecticut doesn't have centralized voting, this would have to be done over a longer period in every one of our municipalities. So whereas states that have adopted early voting, they tend to have centralized voting areas where it's much easier to keep them open for days, weeks at a time. But my real concern has to do with mail-in ballots, including expanding absentee ballots. So if early voting was going to involve mail-in ballots, I'd have a problem with that. If it's guaranteed that it wouldn't, then that would be a non-issue.
Right, early voting is in person at your polling place.
Then the issue for me would be that amending the Constitution should not be done willy-nilly. There are probably good reasons why those provisions are there. And also, I don't think we should impose these costs and this burden onto our registrars and local municipalities.
Okay, and Ms.
Sure.
Ms.
Well,
Reardon?
I'm supportive of early voting, and I hope you will all vote on the ballot to approve it. And then it will go to the legislature, where there will be opportunity for public comment, discourse, looking at what other states have done. But I'm absolutely in support of it, because we can't assume that every single person can get to the polls on that one day. There are life circumstances, there are disabled voters, there are people that need supports to get to the polling place. Those are all factors that are really important, and we shouldn't discriminate and just assume that everyone can get there on the day. In terms of the the no excuse absentee ballot, I absolutely think that's another opportunity for people to be able to vote. I don't see why there's any reason we should put barriers to people being able to vote. Just absolutely.
Anyone who is not able to get to a polling place on time can use an excused absentee ballot. There's no reason to change the law or the Constitution.
Can I just clarify that? Mm-hmm. Well, right now, though, our absentee ballot has the excuse for COVID, but that could go away. And so then you would have to fall under certain parameters to be allowed to do an absentee ballot. So I do think we need to create a no excuse.
Our current absentee ballot allows for people who are not able to make it to the polling place and for illness to cast an absentee ballot. There's no reason to make it a no excuse absentee ballot. There's a reason why we limited absentee ballots because of the inherent problem with all mail-in ballots in the past, and we should not perpetuate COVID era removals of security restrictions on our voting.
Can I just add one more thing?
Sure.
I don't think we should put suspicions around absentee ballot voting. And I don't think that we should assume that there is some sort of security measure. My son's away at college. He was able to cast his ballot and mail it in. That's a completely secure way of voting, and I would hope we would protect that.
May I? Yeah. It's hardly a completely secure way of voting. The problem with all mail-in voting is that it undoes the secrecy of the ballot. If you have a mail-in ballot, you can be sitting in a room with an entire room full of people watching you cast that ballot. You can be subject, particularly if you're an elderly person, to intimidation, to bribery, to undue influence. The problem with mail-in ballots, and this is the reason they don't use them in Europe, and we used to limit them here only to excused absentee ballots, is they are notoriously prone to fraud or to undue ballot influence.
And I'll just leave it that voting is a democratic right, and we should be able to make sure do it. People should be able to vote however they're able to. That's
With a secret ballot, not intimidated.
I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, that was great. We're in the lightning round now, 1 minute with no extra 30 seconds, so think before you speak. This goes first to you, Ms. Radin.
Sure.
How do you define democracy?
Precious. I think that we have all witnessed over the last several years our democracy being threatened. We have folks that don't think that we had a legitimate election a few years ago. You know, I remember on January 6th where I was recovering, and I'm very open about this, from breast cancer surgery. And I sat there in horror at what I saw. And I know how my neighbors felt and my family felt. You know, we've built back from that, and we've had great leadership to do so, but we should never take it for granted. We're in the right place here in Connecticut, but we need to stay there, and we need to make sure that every human being's rights are protected, and that we all have opportunities to vote, and we all have the opportunity to live freely and live our lives with our families and our loved ones without worry for recourse or for having our rights stripped away. We need to protect it. It's precious.
And Mr. DiNardo.
Well, no democracy can support as a purely by majority rule. The wonderful thing about the American system of government is that we balance majority rule with minority rights. And those minority rights are here in the Constitution of the United States. And we should always remember that anyone who has a constitutional right, including parents to direct the upbringing and education of their children, that right cannot be undone by any elected body, any state, any Congress, or any other sub-body, simply by virtue of having been elected by a majority. That's what having a constitutional right means, and without it, you don't have a democracy or a republic.
Can I just add something?
Sure. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
No.
that's right. We can't. That's okay. Thank you.
I
Write it on
I don't mind if you-
vote411.org.
I wouldn't mind if you.
No, it's okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Ms. Radin,
Yeah.
Will you accept the outcome of the November 8th election as certified by the Secretary of the State?
Absolutely.
Mr. DiNardo?
Of course.
Thank you. I'll sleep better. I guess I should watch what I say. Mr. DiNardo, please describe a time when you successfully worked with someone who had an opposing point of view.
Oh my goodness, I think I've done that my entire life. Most recently, I was asked by, I was a certified polling moderator. I think I've let my certification lapse, but many years ago, I was invited frequently by the city of New Haven to act as a polling moderator for them because they needed a Republican and they trusted me. And I knew both registrars, Democrat and Republican in New Haven, quite well. And I was the head moderator for the first same election day voting polling place in New Haven, where we had thousands of people coming down. And we won a commendation from the Democrat Secretary of State for that job that we did. But here's a situation where my job was to ensure that that people who were legally entitled to vote had that opportunity. And I was commended by the Secretary of State because we lawfully processed far more people than any other election day registration polling place in Connecticut. Most of those people who were coming to vote were my political opponents, technically, or voting for someone that I wouldn't have voted for. But yet I protected their right scrupulously as much as I would have anyone else's.
Thank you. And Ms. Radin?
Yeah, thank you. I immediately go to a household of 4 teenagers where nobody agrees with me. But on a more serious note, I immediately think of my service to the Board of Education. It's a two-party board. Up until last year, it was 4 Republicans and 5 Democrats. And I want to share going back in time to when I considered running. And I was a parent that very often frequented those meetings. And I was very hard-pressed to really know what party someone was affiliated with because the work was always for the benefit of the community and the kids. And that has continued. And I'm very proud of that because every year we craft a budget, as most of you know, in this town. And a large portion of the budget is for our schools here. And every year there are hard questions and hard decisions, and we don't agree on things, but we always manage to come to a consensus and put forth a very strong and thoughtful budget. So that's the best example I can think of where we might have differing opinions, but we put those aside for the better of our community.
Thank you. And last question, before your closing statement, is there an issue, this will go first to you, Mr. DiNardo. Is there an issue that we didn't ask you about that you wish that we had, something you'd like to bring up?
Yeah, there's one thing. I'm surprised that no one mentioned, no one asked me where I thought, do I agree that our budget could be cut anywhere, and where that could be? Because I'm asked, as soon as people hear I'm a Republican, that's the first question they ask me, particularly if they're a Democrat. So I wanted to just state that I came across an interesting fact. In 2017, when the state Senate was equally divided between Republicans and Democrats, the Republicans proposed doing a study of waste in the Connecticut budget, expenditures that probably were not doing the job they should be doing and maybe could be cut. And they produced something, well, nothing was done with it, but then Governor Lamont, to his credit, then ordered the study to be done in 2021. It was called the CREATE study. And it identified 200 line item opportunities in 28 agencies that could save $600 to $900 million, almost $1 billion annually in the Connecticut budget. And these recommendations were never enacted, never touched, but we know what they are. So if anyone asks you what should be cut from the budget, there it is. Just refer them to the CREATES report.
Thank you. And Ms. Radin.
Yeah, I'm sitting here with a couple of things, and so I think I'm going to try to wrap it together. We touched a little bit about healthcare and the costs, and I want to talk about that from the perspective of someone, and I share this openly only because I share my breast cancer diagnosis because I think it relates very relatively to the cost of healthcare. When someone's diagnosed with a scary diagnosis, they have a bunch of things they have to think about. How do I treat this? How do I take care of my family? And what will be the financial impact? That financial impact thought should not even have to come into play. So that's one thing I want to continue to talk about in more depth that we didn't really get to talk about too much tonight. Connected to healthcare is the mental health. We talked about that. And when we talk about mental health and we talk about safety in schools and things like that, we need to talk about gun safety legislation. Connecticut has some incredible, it's exemplary throughout the country. People look to Connecticut around their gun legislation. And I am proud of our he's still our state representative, Sean Scanlon, and Christine Cohen and others who really brought forth some really critical legislation that really touched this community deeply. So I'd like to see us work on that more.
Thank you. And now it's time for closing statements, and Ms. Radin goes first with 1 minute.
Sure. Well, thank you again to the women voters of the Eastern Shoreline. I really enjoyed this opportunity to get to talk to you and answer some questions and see some really happy, familiar faces in the group. I'm here today because I really believe that leadership matters. I believe anyone seeking the office of state representative should have a record of service to their community, demonstrating an investment in its success and genuine, long-standing relationships with residents across the district. I believe my record of service to this community positions me well to take on the challenges of your next state representative. You have a choice on November 8th that could not be more important than ever. I hope my record of service, my sincere, genuine approach to problem solving, my professional background, and my absolute passion for this community will encourage you to cast your vote for me next Tuesday. Leadership matters, and I commit here that I will be the kind of leader that all of you can be proud of, that you can trust, and that you know will be a fervent advocate and ally for you in the General Assembly. So thank you.
And Mr. DiNardo.
Well, I'd like to thank the League again for holding this debate. My family moved to Connecticut from the Bronx in 1972 because mismanagement by a city beholden to special interests, corruption, excessive taxation, and overregulation turned a safe, beautiful neighborhood with intact families and excellent public schools into a dystopian nightmare that both businesses and people fled. Connecticut in those days seemed like a paradise to us. It was a Republican state with no income tax, had a small state government that tended to leave you alone. Businesses and people flowed into Connecticut from surrounding states. Our economy was driven by good manufacturing jobs that enabled people like my father, who only had a high school diploma, to own a home and support his family on one income. Then the state began to change. We imposed an income tax. The state government grew to 4 times its former size, and I fear now that we are pursuing many of the same failed policies that destroyed working families in the Bronx, which I witnessed firsthand. And sure enough, businesses and people who once clamored to move to Connecticut are fleeing to other states. So I'm running as a Republican candidate for state representative to put Connecticut's people and our economy back on the right track.
Thank you. That concludes our debate. We urge you to visit the League of Women Voters of Connecticut online voter guide at vote411.org, where I hope that the candidates have all answered questions so you can learn more about their points of view. And you can also learn where your polling place is, because some of the lines have changed. You can confirm that you are registered to vote. And you can also learn more about the constitutional amendment that's being proposed on the referendum. We thank the Guilford Community Center for the use of this room. We're grateful for Branford Community TV for recording this debate, which will be available from BCTV and other community TV stations, and from the League of Women Voters of the East Shore YouTube channel. And I thank Daniel Arman and Elise Lowe for members of the East Shore League for organizing all of our debates. And we greatly appreciate the League members and the candidates and the people in the audience for making this such a successful debate.